Somewhere in the North Pacific, beneath a surface that looks empty, something is moving. This ocean is louder than it looks. There are calls moving through it right now that carry for hundreds of kilometers, calls that are not random, calls that have dialects. A mother, her adult son, her daughter's calf. They have traveled together every day of their lives, and they will continue to travel together every day for life. In the entire animal kingdom, almost nothing else does this. We have studied them for 50 years. We have named every individual. We have catalogued their calls and their family trees and their hunting strategies. We thought we understood what held them together. Then, on a remote beach on a Russian island, a marine biologist found this. The family that kills. How fear built one of the most complex societies on Earth. The answer to why orca families are the way they are may have been hiding in the nature of their world the entire time. This film is about what a few severed fins on a Russian beach just changed about everything we thought we knew. A male orca stays with his mother for his entire life. Not until adolescence. Not until he can fend for himself. For his entire life. When she dies, the mortality rate for her adult sons spikes dramatically. In some cases, they do not survive her by more than a year. Almost every other mammal predator disperses. Wolf pups leave the pack. Lion cubs are driven out. Bear cubs are pushed away. This is the rule of large predator life. At some point, you go and build your own territory. Orcas do not do this. The question that has puzzled scientists for decades is, why? Resident orca societies are built on a structure called the matriline. A female, her sons and daughters, and her daughter's offspring, sometimes spanning 5 generations, all traveling together all the time. It is the most stable social unit of any non-human mammal we have ever documented. And then there are the others, the ones who don't behave this way. Rather, they travel in groups of 2 to 6, quiet when they hunt, eating marine mammals, seals, porpoises, dolphins, never mixing with the fish eaters, even in the same water, never interbreeding, never interacting. 2 types of orca that share an ocean and share almost nothing else. The question that the fins on that Russian beach just raised is this. What if the strange family structure of resident orcas was not built by cooperation? What if it was built by fear? In the early 1970s, a Canadian marine biologist named Michael Bigg began counting orca populations in British Columbia. The government wanted to know how many there were before the aquarium industry captured more of them. Bigg expected to find thousands. What he actually found was a few hundred, and in documenting them, he discovered something that changed everything. Bigg realized that every orca dorsal fin is unique. The shape, the nicks, the scarring, the saddle patch behind it, no 2 are alike. He and his colleagues began photographing every individual they encountered and tracking who was seen with whom. This was the birth of photo identification research. What it revealed over years of patient observation was that these animals were not a loose population. They were families. The matriarch sits at the center of everything. She knows the salmon runs. She remembers where food was found in years of scarcity. When old matriarchs die, the cohesion of their matriline weakens. Younger orcas in leaderless groups make worse foraging decisions. The knowledge she carries is not instinct. It is experience accumulated over decades and passed on. Culture, in the most literal sense of the word. Bigg's work was extended by other researchers. Ken Balcom at the Center for Whale Research in Washington, John Ford in British Columbia. Together they built something remarkable, a multi-generational record of named individuals, family relationships, births and deaths, extending from the 1970s to today. It is among the longest continuous wildlife studies ever conducted, and it consistently showed the same thing. Residents do not leave their families. The other ecotype, what researchers now call Bigg's orcas, named for Michael Bigg himself, was discovered almost simultaneously. Same waters, same physical appearance at a distance, completely different animals in almost every meaningful way. Where residents are loud, Biggs are silent while hunting. Where residents live in large, stable pods, Biggs move in small, fluid groups. Where residents eat fish, Biggs eat other mammals, including, as it turns out, dolphins, and even other orcas. The acoustic difference alone is extraordinary. Resident pods are among the most vocal animals on Earth. Their calls identify individual family groups. Each matriline has a dialect, a set of calls that calves learn from their mothers and carry for life. When a resident pod is nearby, they announce it. Bigs approaching prey go nearly silent. The two types of orca evolved entirely different relationships with sound, in the same ocean, in the same centuries. Genomic analysis tells us that Big's orcas diverged from the ancestral lineage somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Residents diverged later, around 100,000 years ago. In the 10,000 years since the last ice age, there has been no evidence of mating between them. They are, by any practical measure, different species that science has not yet officially separated. The obvious answer to why residents stay in families was cooperation. Hunting salmon is harder alone. Large family groups can herd and coordinate. More eyes find more fish. Older animals know the best fishing grounds. The matriarch's knowledge keeps the group fed. The logic was clean, compelling, and supported by the data. The cooperation theory was strengthened by research on grandmother orcas. Female residents live past their reproductive years, sometimes reaching 80, and spend their post-reproductive decades helping raise grand-offspring and leading the group to food. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showed that grand-offspring of post-reproductive females had significantly better survival rates. The grandmother hypothesis was elegant and well supported. And then there was the data on sons. Male residents stay with their mothers not just until they can hunt alone, but permanently. When their mothers die, adult sons show dramatically elevated mortality in the months that follow. This suggested the bond was not merely strategic. Males were not staying for the hunting advantage. They were staying for something harder to define. The cooperation story started to look incomplete. Big's orcas, who eat similar prey to other large marine mammal hunters, do not have this system. Males sometimes separate from their mothers and travel as rovers. The social structure is more flexible, more contingent. If tight family bonds were simply about cooperative hunting, Bigs should have evolved a similar system. They did not. Something else was shaping resident society. The Finns changed the question, or rather, they revealed that the right question had never quite been asked. In August 2022, Sergei Fomin, a marine biologist at Russia's Pacific Institute of Geography, was walking the beach on Bering Island in the Commander Islands, a remote archipelago in the western Bering Sea. He was accustomed to finding carcass remains there. The area is hunting territory for Big's orcas, and the shoreline regularly accumulates the remains of their prey: Baird's beaked whales, minke whales, harbor porpoises. He saw the fin from a distance and initially thought nothing of it. When he got close enough to see what it was, he stopped. It was a killer whale fin, not the prey, the predator. And it was covered in tooth marks that he recognized immediately, the evenly spaced, deep impressions of another orca's jaws. He photographed it carefully. He sent the photographs to Olga Filatova, a whale researcher at the University of Southern Denmark, who had been his longtime research collaborator in the region. Filatova knew immediately what she was looking at. The tooth marks were Orca. The fin had come from a resident killer whale, a fish-eater, and the marks were consistent with the jaws of a Big's orca, a mammal-eater. 2 years later, in July 2024, Fomin found a second fin, 2 kilometers from the first. Same tooth marks, same story. At that moment, I started thinking that this is a pattern, Filatova said. Genetic testing of tissue from both fins was decisive. Both had come from resident killer whales, specifically from the fish-eating ecotype of the North Pacific. The fins were tough and of little nutritional value. They got in the way of reaching the muscle and blubber underneath, so the attacker would have torn them off and discarded them. What was eaten was not the fin. The fin was the evidence left behind. Filatova and her colleagues then reconstructed the likely timeline. Resident orcas gather periodically in large multipod aggregations for breeding, events where family groups that normally travel separately come together, spreading apart from their usual tight formations to find unrelated mates. These are the moments of maximum vulnerability. The tight protective envelope of the family group is loosened. and it was in the days just before the second fin was found that satellite tracking showed exactly such a gathering had taken place nearby. Filatova's analysis identified the first fin as likely from a young male, the second from either an adult female or juvenile male. This is not random. Big's orcas, she told reporters, go after younger residents, especially juveniles who have somehow become separated from the protection of their family group. During the mating aggregations, when adults are distracted, juveniles can become exposed. This is the easiest way for mammal eaters to attack the young ones, she said, simply because everyone else is distracted. The research paper, published in the journal Marine Mammal Science on February 8, 2026, proposed something that no paper had formally argued before: that Big's orcas periodically prey on resident orcas, and that this predation pressure may be the primary reason resident orca societies evolved the way they did. The tight family group is not just about cooperation. It is, at least partly, a defense. 2 fins, 2 kilometers apart, 2 years apart, both from residents, both marked with the jaws of something larger, something that had decided these fish eaters were prey. To understand why the defense hypothesis matters, you need to understand what resident social structure actually looks like. The matriline can span 5 generations. The eldest female is the anchor. Her sons never leave. Her daughters never leave. Her daughters' children never leave. The group functions as a single coordinated unit, and that coordination has a measurable effect on survival. Research from the Center for Whale Research showed that adult male residents whose mothers had died were 14 times more likely to die in the year following her death than males whose mothers were still alive, 14 times. For adult males in their 30s and 40s, animals fully capable of hunting independently. The mother's presence was not just valuable, it was, for her sons, apparently essential. The post-reproductive female is one of the most biologically unusual things in the mammalian world. Female residents stop reproducing in their 30s or 40s and may live another 40 years afterward. In almost every other species, evolution ends life cycles when it ends the ability to reproduce further. Residents are salmon specialists. In the Pacific Northwest, they are so focused on Chinook salmon that in years of poor Chinook abundance, resident orca populations show elevated calf mortality and nutritional stress. The knowledge of where and when the salmon run is not something a young orca can discover independently in a single season. It accumulates over years. The matriarch, who has lived through 30 salmon seasons, carries information that may be the difference between her family surviving and not. Big's orcas hunt differently because their prey is different. Mammals are intelligent and alert. Seals hear the approach. Dolphins recognize individual orca calls. A Big's orca that announces itself loses its hunt. This is why they evolved silence as a hunting strategy and why their social groups are small. Fewer animals means less noise, less disturbance. The stealth that makes them effective mammal hunters also makes them effective ambush predators of other orcas. The scope of what Big's orcas will kill is genuinely extraordinary. In 2019, groups of Big's orcas were documented killing blue whales off the coast of Western Australia, the largest animals ever to have lived. They killed 3. They use coordinated attack strategies involving precise roles, animals driving the prey toward the surface, animals blocking escape routes, animals suffocating the prey by pressing down on its back. This is not instinct, this is culture, and it is applied, at least occasionally, to their own kind. Big's males sometimes separate from their families and travel as what researchers call rovers, adult males who occasionally leave their mothers for periods, forming temporary alliances before sometimes returning. This flexibility makes sense for a stealth predator in small groups. It does not make sense for a prey animal that needs numbers for protection. Resident males may have evolved lifelong philopatry, never leaving home, precisely because leaving was dangerous. Filatova's paper notes something she had observed in her own fieldwork. Big's orcas actively avoided large groups of residents. When a large resident pod was in an area, the Bigs would leave and return only after the residents had moved on. So it looks like this defense strategy is really working, she said. The large group deters the predator shapes the group. Each side of this evolutionary arms race is being built by the other. In 2016, a Big's adult male and his post-reproductive mother were documented killing a resident newborn calf. They did not eat it. The researchers who published the account in scientific reports concluded this was sexually selected infanticide. By killing the calf, the male created a reproductive opportunity, since the grieving mother would return to fertility sooner. His own post-reproductive mother joined the attack because her son's offspring would be her grandchildren, and evolution does not distinguish between the two. It was the first documented case of Orca infanticide, and the only documented case of this joint behavior outside of humans. In the summer of 2018, a resident orca named J35 was observed carrying her dead calf at the surface for 17 days and over 1,000 miles. Researchers described it as a tour of grief. She eventually let the calf go. The coverage was global. What almost no one reported at the time was that J35's calf had died in an area that was also frequented by Big's orcas, and that the cause of death remained officially listed as unknown. The architecture of resident society can be read now, with this new evidence, as something built under pressure. The matriline is not just a family, it is a defensive formation. The males who never leave are not dependent, they are bodyguards. The post-reproductive grandmothers who lead the group to food are also the animals with the most experience of where danger comes from and how to avoid it. Every layer of the structure has a purpose that may have been shaped, at least in part, by threat. None of this erases the cooperative benefits. The family group hunts better together. The grandmother's knowledge matters. The sons benefit from their mother's experience. These are real and documented advantages. What the Bering Island evidence suggests is that the full picture has two drivers, not one. Cooperation kept them together and made the group effective. Predation pressure may be what originally pushed them into the group in the first place. Two lineages diverged 100,000 years ago at minimum, sharing the same water, never mating, never socializing, each shaped by a world that the other defined. A predator that made a prey animal smarter, more bonded, more complex. A prey animal that may have forced a predator to be more stealthy, more specialized, more culturally distinct. They built each other. Not everyone is convinced. Luke Rendell, a marine biologist at the University of St Andrews in Scotland who was not involved in the research, told Live Science that while the cannibalism observations are interesting and the idea is worthy of further investigation, there is not yet enough evidence to build a solid account of the social evolution of fish-eating orcas. Two fins, he and others noted, are simply two fins. Pattern recognition from a very small sample is a scientific risk. And the mechanism proposed, that juveniles become exposed during mating aggregations, is inferred, not observed. No one has filmed a Big's orca attacking a resident. The fins are aftermath, not event. The hypothesis that connects the evidence to the conclusion is logical and supported by circumstantial evidence, but it is a hypothesis. The scientific community is not at consensus, and Filatova herself was measured in her claims. There is a further complication in the word cannibalism itself. Technically, cannibalism requires members of the same species. Technically, residents and Big's are the same species, Orcinus orca. But Filatova and others argue, with growing genomic support, that they are distinct enough to warrant separate species designation. They almost certainly do not perceive themselves as belonging to the same species, she said. For the transient groups, the resident killer whales are simply prey. The physical evidence for divergence is real. Big's orcas are larger and more robust. Their jaw structure is adapted for biting and gripping large, struggling prey. Their saddle patches are morphologically distinct. DNA testing in 2023 was able to assign individuals to ecotype from genetics alone with near-perfect accuracy. These are not simply dietary preferences. These are different animals undergoing the early stages of speciation. Rake marks are common in the population records. Orca teeth dragged across the skin of another orca. They appear on residents in patterns consistent with attacks from larger animals. For decades, researchers noted them as signs of aggression within pods, disciplinary bites, play, social dominance. The possibility that some of them were from Big's attacks was not seriously entertained until the fins. The limits of the evidence are real, and they matter. Orcas live in vast ocean ranges. Attacks, if they occur, happen in open water, at depth, often at night. The probability of a research team being present to observe a Big's orca attacking a resident is extremely low. Absence of observation is not observation of absence. We have two fins. We have tooth marks. We have genetic identification. We do not have video. The predation pressure hypothesis is also currently a model, not a measured historical reality. We cannot observe what happened 100,000 years ago when resident social structure was being shaped. We can build mathematical models that show the evolutionary plausibility of predation driving philopatry. Those models support the hypothesis. They do not confirm it. In science, that distinction matters. The historical record on orca cannibalism is murky. Some 19th and 20th century reports noted what appeared to be orca tissue in orca stomach contents. Most researchers attributed this to scavenging. Orcas eating the remains of individuals killed by whalers, not predation. One documented case involves an orca being attacked by companions after being shot by humans. These prior records suggest intraspecific aggression exists in the orca world, but they do not clearly establish the predator-prey dynamic that the Bering Island research proposes. Filatova was careful in how she framed the conclusion. "At least now we know that cannibalism happens," she said, "but I think it is not super common. This is the language of measured science. The evidence shows the behavior occurred at least twice. It does not establish frequency. It does not establish causation in the social structure question. What it does is raise a legitimate new hypothesis about why resident orcas are the way they are, backed by physical evidence that did not previously exist. We have studied these animals for 50 years and named every individual in the North Pacific. We know their family trees, their dialects, their hunting techniques, their grief. And we still cannot see what happens in the deep water when the families are separated and the wrong whale comes close. The ocean keeps its secrets carefully. The cooperation hypothesis remains strong and is not invalidated by the new evidence. Resident orcas living in large matrilineal groups have measurably better outcomes on multiple fronts. Calves of post-reproductive grandmothers survive better. Pods with experienced matriarchs find food more efficiently during scarcity years. Larger groups coordinate salmon drives that smaller groups cannot execute. The benefits of the family structure are real and documented. The predation pressure hypothesis argues that it was the threat from Big's orcas that originally pushed residents into permanent family groups, and that cooperation was selected for within that already established structure. Under this model, the answer to why sons never leave is partly that leaving meant being alone in a sea that contained something that would eat you. Staying was safer. The ones who stayed had more descendants than the ones who left. A third view holds that both drivers operated simultaneously, and that they are not competing explanations but complementary ones. The same trait, lifelong family cohesion, could be simultaneously selected for because it improves hunting outcomes and because it reduces predation risk. Evolution rarely has a single cause. The pressure from Big's orcas and the benefits of cooperation may have acted as dual selective forces on the same social trait, each reinforcing the outcome the other was already pushing toward. The cultural inheritance argument adds a fourth layer. Orca social structure is transmitted through learning. Calves learn their family's dialect, their hunting techniques, their range and feeding grounds from their mothers and older family members. Whatever social structure first emerged, for whatever reason, would be reinforced by each generation that learned it and passed it on. Culture can make a behavioral trait essentially permanent, even if the original selective pressure diminishes. The structure, once established, teaches itself to survive. The debate that the February 2026 paper opened is unlikely to close on two fins. It will require more evidence, population studies comparing social structure and Big's encounter rates across different regions, historical analysis of predation pressure proxies, possibly camera trap or drone documentation of actual encounters. Science moves by accumulation. The fins were the first two pieces of something that will eventually be a much larger picture. Orcas live in every ocean on Earth. They range from the Arctic to the Antarctic, from cold coastal waters to the open tropics. There are ecotypes in the Norwegian fjords that chase herring, types in the Antarctic that wave-wash seals off ice floes, types that hunt sharks. The diversity within a single species is extraordinary, and the social structures vary alongside the hunting strategies. The story we are telling here is one story from one part of one ocean. It may or may not generalize. The southern resident killer whales, the J, K, and L pods of the Salish Sea, number 73 individuals as of 2024. They are listed as endangered. Their primary crisis is not predation, it is salmon. Specifically, the collapse of Chinook salmon runs that they depend on almost exclusively. These are the whales most thoroughly documented, most named, most individually known. They are dying in a quiet way, one season at a time, from a shortage of fish in waters that humans have been overfishing and blocking with dams for a century. Chinook salmon account for between 70 and 90% of the southern residents' diet, depending on the season. In years of poor Chinook abundance, the resident population shows elevated mortality of calves and nutritional stress in adults. The whale at the top of the food chain is dependent on a fish whose populations have been reduced by dams, habitat degradation, and commercial fishing pressure. The matriarch's knowledge of where the salmon run matters less and less when the salmon are not running. The southern residents are also the most watched whale population on Earth. Thousands of tourists pay to see them annually. The complexity of their social structure, the grief of J35, the acrobatics of spy-hopping juveniles, these things are economically legible in ways that the genomic research on ecotype divergence is not. We know these animals as individuals, we love them as individuals, and we are watching them slowly starve. These two lineages have been separated for at least 100,000 years. They have watched the Ice Age end, watched the coastlines reshape, watched the salmon populations fluctuate across millennia. They were here before the Salish Sea was named. They were here before humans arrived on its shores. The story of what shaped them is written in geological time, and we are only now beginning to read it. The parallel to human social structure is uncomfortable and worth sitting with. Post-reproductive grandmothers who improve their grand-offspring's survival rates. Sons who remain near their mothers and suffer elevated mortality when those mothers die. Extended families as the basic unit of survival. Cultural knowledge passed between generations by living with elders who carry it. These are not uniquely human arrangements. They evolved independently in a marine mammal lineage in a cold ocean over 100,000 years. We are witnessing in geological time the birth of two species. Filatova said it directly. We are witnessing an evolutionary process. These two groups, which never mix, are becoming increasingly distinct. At some point, they will be so different that they will become separate species. This is speciation in real time, not the millions of years of isolation that usually drives it, but cultural divergence, dietary specialization, and the social structures that grow from it, driving two lineages apart in the same ocean without a geographical barrier between them. Culture as a driver of speciation is rare and remarkable. In most species, geographic isolation separates populations long enough for genetic drift and natural selection to accumulate differences. In orcas, the mechanism is behavioral conformity. Calves inherit their mother's dietary specialization, her vocal dialect, her social group, and the behaviors that flow from them. Two animals in the same ocean can become functionally separate species because of what they learn to eat and who they learn it from. Big's orcas are moving into the rapidly warming Arctic as sea ice retreats. They are encountering beluga whale and narwhal populations that evolved in an apex predator-free environment and have no predator avoidance behaviors for orcas. The consequences for those populations are being documented in real time. The behavioral flexibility and cultural learning that made Big's orcas effective in the North Pacific is being applied to a new ocean with prey that has no defenses. The predator that may have shaped resident society is now shaping something else. What we learned from captivity tells its own story. Orcas removed from their family groups in the 1960s and 1970s showed signs of severe psychological distress, aggression, repetitive behaviors, collapsed dorsal fins. They died far younger than their wild counterparts. The social bonds that the new research suggests may be shaped partly by predation pressure turned out to be so fundamental that removing an orca from its family was essentially a lethal act performed slowly. The captivity era ended. The lesson it left was about the depth of what we had disrupted. The acoustic research is ongoing and continues to produce remarkable findings. Resident orca dialects are pod-specific. A calf learns its matriline's calls within months of birth and retains them for life. Researchers can identify which pod a recorded call belongs to without ever seeing the animal. This is not instinct, it is learned language, passed from mother to calf, encoding group membership in sound. Every calf born into the southern resident population is documented, named, and watched. The population has been below 100 individuals for decades. Biologists argue about which intervention matters most: salmon restoration, vessel noise reduction, contaminant reduction. The social knowledge argues for another priority: the matriarchs. Losing an experienced older female from a critically small population removes not just one individual, but the accumulated knowledge of decades, the glue that holds a matriline together. The research on grandmothers suggests that losing the oldest animals may accelerate decline faster than losing young adults. Sergei Fomin found the second fin in July 2024. He had found the first in August 2022. 2 years of thinking about what it might mean. 2 years of waiting to see if it would happen again. When he saw the second fin, 2 kilometers from the first, he sent the photographs to Filatova. At that moment, she said, I started thinking that this is a pattern. In science, that is the moment everything shifts. Ken Balcom has studied the southern residents since 1976. He has named them, documented their births and deaths, attended their grief and their celebrations. He knows individual whales the way a neighbor knows a face. The researchers who work on these animals over decades develop something that is not quite the same as scientific detachment. They are in a relationship with their subjects, and the subjects keep revealing things that the relationship had not yet made visible. J35, the orca researchers know as Tahlequah, gave birth to a calf on July 24, 2018. The calf died within 30 minutes. She carried it at the surface for 17 days and more than 1,000 miles. Every morning she was observed still supporting the body, pushing it toward the surface with her rostrum. On August 11th, she let it go. Researchers who had been watching her called it a tour of grief. Biologists debated for months what the behavior meant and whether the word grief was appropriate. The debate has not fully resolved. What she was experiencing is still officially unknown. The people who study orcas for a career share something with the people who end up in any proximity to these animals for any amount of time. There is a moment, the first time a dorsal fin, that tall breaks the surface that close. When the brain does something it does not often do, it goes quiet. The scale does not compute. The intelligence implied in the way they move together does not compute. And then they are gone, and you are standing on the bow of a boat in the Pacific, slightly changed. Filatova has been studying orcas in Russian waters for decades. The Bering Island research emerged not from a planned study, but from a colleague's walk along a beach. Science often works this way: the unexpected find, the photograph sent in the middle of the night, the pattern that only reveals itself when you have been patient enough to wait for it twice. She was measured when she described the conclusions, but the framing she offered was not measured at all. For the transient groups, the resident killer whales are simply prey. That sentence, once read, does not leave. Look at that sun again. He has never left her. He is 30 years old and has never spent more than a few hours separated from the group. In the beginning of this film, that looked like devotion. Now it looks like something else as well. It looks like the inheritance of a strategy. Stay with the group or be alone in a sea that contains something that will eat you. He does not know that logic. He knows his mother. The central question of this film was, why do orca families stay together forever? We now have at least 2 answers, and they are both probably true. They stay because the group is more effective than the individual, and they stay because something in the ocean made being alone dangerous. The tightness of the formation, the sons who never leave, the grandmothers who outlive their fertility, these are not accidents or mysteries. They are the architecture of survival, built over 100,000 years of pressure from within and without. And the fin on the beach is not a crime scene anymore. It is a piece of evidence in a much longer story. A story about two lineages diverging in the same ocean over 100,000 years, each one shaping what the other became. The predator made the prey more bonded. The bonded prey made the predator more stealthy. The beach on Bering Island is where that story briefly became visible. We tend to think of complex social structure as something that intelligence built, a deliberate architecture of cooperation that smart animals figured out because cooperation is better. The Orca story complicates that. The tight family bonds of residents may have been built as much by threat as by benefit. Fear and cooperation are not opposites in the evolutionary story. Fear may have been the original architect, and cooperation what grew inside the walls fear built. The matriarch carries something that has no name in science's current vocabulary. She carries decades of experience encoded in behavior, in root knowledge, in the capacity to recognize danger that her grand-offspring have never encountered. When she dies, that is gone. Not the genes, the knowledge. The thing that made the genes matter. This is what culture does in a species that transmits it. It makes the individual more than their biology, and it makes their death more costly than a gene pool calculation would suggest. There is something disorienting about the intimacy of this relationship. These two populations have been shaping each other for 100,000 years without ever acknowledging it. The residents do not know they evolved to protect against the bigs. The bigs do not know they pushed the residents into the families they became. They are engaged in an evolutionary conversation that neither party is aware of, in an ocean they share without speaking. J35 had another calf in 2020. The calf named Phoenix survived and has been documented healthy in subsequent surveys. She carries her grief and her new life in the same body, in the same ocean, with the same family around her. We assigned her our word for what she did in 2018. Whether it was what we meant by it, we do not know. What we know is that she continued. The family continued. The structure that may have been built partly by fear continues to produce the things worth protecting. The ocean has been running this experiment for 100,000 years. We arrived 50 years ago with cameras and hydrophones and began taking notes. What we have so far is extraordinary, partial, and changing every season. The fins on the beach were a correction to our model. There will be more corrections. The ocean has not shown us everything yet. Somewhere in the North Pacific right now, in water too dark to see, a resident pod is moving. The matriarch is at the center. Her adult sons flank the outside. The calves are in the middle. They are communicating in calls that encode who they are and who they belong to. And somewhere in the same water, something quiet is watching. The juvenile does not know the history that made its family. It knows the sound of its mother's call, the shape of the salmon run, the geometry of the group that it has never left and will never leave. It is looking at the world above the surface with the same curiosity that we bring to the world below. We are watching each other across a boundary. What the other side is thinking is still, after 50 years of study, mostly unknown. What else is being shaped right now in the dark water by forces we have not found yet? Two fins changed a question we had been asking for 50 years. Science works this way sometimes. The answers are in places we did not think to look, found by someone who happened to be walking a beach on a cold morning in the right place and the right time. There is more to find. There always is. That is what this channel is for. If this film shifted something, subscribe to Our World and Beyond and leave a thought in the comments. And the next time you see something that does not fit the story you were told, pay attention. That is usually where the real story begins.